On the behalf of eGovernment Research Group, we are honored and pleased to welcome you all to our first seminar, eGovernment, Theories and Practices. eGovernment Research Group was established this year with a collaboration of AOIS and University of Slemania. As this is our first seminar, we would like to introduce eGovernment in business, technology and in strategic point of view, and present future vision of eGovernment in developing countries and regions such as Kurdistan. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Farzad Sanati. He received his PhD from University of Technology, Sydney. For his research, he works on eGovernment intelligence service integration. He has worked over 14 years for Australian federal and state governments in large-scale eGovernment design and implementation projects. Farzad has been giving advice to Chinese government officials from eGovernment and ICT Department of Jiangsu Province, the hub of information technology industry in China. Farzad is currently teaching information technology in the American University of Iraq, AOIS. He's also working on the eGovernment project at the IT Research Laboratory at AOIS. His research interests are in the area of eGovernment service integration, business intelligence, and service-oriented architecture.
E-government, theories and practice. First of all, I would like to welcome all our guests for this seminar, especially guests from outside the university and Suleimani University. In this session, we would like to talk about electronic government and theories and practices. And this is how we're going to progress on this seminar. I will produce an introduction for you, and I'll explain how what is electronic government and what is not electronic government. Then I'll move on to introducing some research trends in the field of electronic government, which mostly covered in journals, international journals, which is a collection of around 19 to 20 international journals in IS and IT. Then I will present some statistics about research done in electronic government and different trends in this area. Then I will talk about the governance of electronic government and how governments actually approach this area of knowledge and implementation. Then finally, we'll talk about how we implement the electronic government in practice. I will give some examples in some advanced governments, including the United States, UK, and Australia. And then we'll try to connect that to the current situation in Kurdistan and Iraq. Okay, so we want to talk about electronic government. First of all, I would like to mention what is not electronic government, just to clear the air and clear some of the misunderstandings that people have about electronic government. Electronic government is not the computerization of existing government processes and procedures. It is also not digitalization of files and documents of the government. Basically, electronic government is not equal to technology and digitalization. Okay, let's see what is electronic government. In simple description, we can say electronic government is about applying information and communication technology to all aspects of the government business, where it makes sense to improve efficiency and effectiveness in achieving of policies and program outcomes. So it all boils down to one particular equation, which we say electronic government is equal to change management and transformation. We're talking about the transformation of existing government procedures and processes in order to make sure that we have a sustainable and achievable electronic government process. The third area of research about electronic government is recognized to be the technical and development issues about electronic government, which mostly include development strategies, what are the strategies for development of electronic government,
life cycle activities, testing, development, methodologies, tools, project management, implementations, operations, data processing, mainly technological view of those things, right? And a fourth one is about the applications and categorization or categories that includes topics related to things like types of applications that we use in electronic government, or communication services, documentation management systems, components of applications for products within the electronic government. We're looking at characteristics of applications and products within this large e-government body of knowledge. And finally, the last trend that we recognized within these 910 articles is mostly about the research itself, which is categorized in status and the maturity of electronic government. Okay, so how mature are in terms of research. Okay, so how well we are actually researching in e-government. We also in this research area we're looking at trends in e-government. What type of ways where are we going in terms of research in electronic government. Also, we're looking at historical projects in electronic government areas. And by putting all these together, we come up with some statistics. Okay, the statistics show that most of the advanced countries in the world are actually producing the most research artifacts in electronic government. As you can see, the first three countries on the top, US and UK and Australia, are producing around 50% of everything, right? So I just wanted to emphasize these things. Whichever country or whichever organization, not just only country, not just only government, does any implementation without planning and research, it's doomed to fail. It will definitely fail because it will end up with chaotic development, and then these kind of developments are always ends up in going back to the first square and redoing everything that it's been done. And on top of that, other issues that we can actually point on or put our fingers on is about two important keywords. One is information overload, and the other one is the duplication of services. So governments, and when they are developing electronic government facilities or electronic government services without planning and research in advance, they end up developing duplicate services by multiple agencies within the same government, and that will cause these two effects. Information overload, which will directly affect the citizens, and the duplicated services, which is costly practice for any government. And the other thing I would like to actually mention is that those three countries that you can see on the top are the most producers of research. But they just happen to be the most advanced e-government implementation of e-government in the world. So it is not really accidental that most advanced electronic government implementation resulted in the most publications and most research in electronic government. And this is just statistics about e-government research. If you go and do statistics on about any research in any scientific fact or any scientific field, you will see the same results. So basically, the moral of this story is that the more we research, the more we practice, the more we plan, the better we be prepared, and with the better we implement our goals. Now, with this, I will just move into my second session, which is about talking about how governments actually governing the implementation of e-government. So the requirements of this implementation. Now, we're imagining that the research has been done. Now, the governments want to implement these plans that they have in the future. So what are the actual dimensions of this governance? And what are the goals and outputs of such a governance? On the left-hand side, you can see five different aspects of or dimensions of governance. Starts with the leadership. Of course, every action would require a leadership, right? And the leadership would need things such as, of course, this is not comprehensive list. It's just a sample list about legal frameworks, ICT policies and standards. So everything starts with this standardization. So if you're not standardizing, then you will end up different agencies developing different things in different standards. And then at the end, you end up with the chaos that you started, the chaos that you actually intended to counter. Now you're creating the same chaos. Therefore, you need a legal framework. The first thing in electronic government, it doesn't happen with the computerization. It happens in the parliament, with legal frameworks, with laws, with regulations. So everything that happens in the future has to follow those laws and regulations and standardization. For example, in Australia, we have a department dedicated to standardize ICT in Australia, ICT practiced by government. So if you're a government body and you want to develop a website, you cannot use .NET. You have to use J2EE, just as an example, all right? Because it's standardized. The government says you cannot do otherwise. Why? Because you wanted to standardize the technology, you wanted to standardize the implementation and the framework. And if you come down on the same list, we will see the human resources. After our legal framework and ICT policies and standardization, then you have to make the connectivity and the data framework and the processing infrastructure for this to happen. And of course, the goal is to produce services out of those data that you are producing. Below that, we will see institutionalization, which is about the infrastructure and the service delivery. What does that mean? That means government has to have a workforce in order to deliver the services. You cannot just produce a web service or produce a website or produce an electronic system and then just float it in the air. You need to have a people. You need to train your people in your institutions in order to make sure it's maintainable, it's expandable, and it's also available, always available because you can support it. Of course, at the bottom you can have the technology and the finance, which is, you can see the thing that everybody thinks is the most important is actually at the bottom of the list. Yeah. So after we did all of these, leadership, human resource, and institutionalization, then we'll come up with, have a look at the technology, what technology is available for us to implement, and then we see whether we can actually afford it, which is the last one, and find financing of it. When we do that, then we'll have to look at, we'll talk about this a little more further in implementation part. We're talking about how government systems are conceptually split in between into front office and back office, or front end and back end. Okay, now we assume that all of these are in place and the government has a wheel, has the plan to do it, has done the research and everything that it's supposed to be done. Now, how we implement this governance, how we start doing anything, right? So the process of governance starts with defining the vision and the goals. What does that mean, version? We mean that the first primary thing that this word is conveying is that nothing happens in a big bang. Okay? You cannot overnight or over a year or over a decade have a big electronic government without having baby steps and milestones along the way. So from the project management point of view, you need to have milestones. You need to have processes. You need to have stages of development, which probably sometimes we call them phases, okay, different phases of implementation. Then you have to define those phases. It's in the basic requirements of how we actually develop projects. The other thing is the setup in high-level leadership task force. Okay, so this list is corresponding exactly to what it was in the previous slide, right? So we need to know who's leading this. You cannot have police force develop their own, education department develop their own, and so on. you need a overseeing institution, an institution that oversees everything that happens throughout the government sector, right? So that's why you need to start a task force and give this task force the goal of managing everything and starting up everything. And then you have to put in place the government management framework. Then this task force starts putting forward a framework about how we go about starting this development. Then we have to assess the priority needs. Now, of course, let's say, for example, in Australia, the priority needs is things, for example, social security or education or things like that. But priorities change in different countries. For example, in our country, in this country, Iraq or Kurdistan, the priority is security. The priority is probably military. So the prioritization of the implementation is a massive task as well. And it doesn't really, it's not that simple to figure out. You have to do the study, you have to see how it works. And then you have to establish the partnership with private sector. Government cannot do these things by themselves for many reasons. First is economically, may not, especially here, we know they can't afford it. Okay, so private sector involvement is a very important factor. We have to be able to do that. So the government needs the private sector in both financial assistance, also from technological point of view. Government don't have, or they really cannot afford the highest degree of technical expertise and professionals. They don't have it. They have to borrow it, or they have to obtain it or acquire it with a partnership with the private sector. That is really important. Then we're looking at the development time-bound development. Again, goes back to the square one. We need to have a proper project, massive project, or probably you could call it a program, right? So this program must have a boundaries of time. That means you don't have an open-ended project going on forever. You need to make sure that everything you do has a deadline. If you can't achieve that deadline, then you have to rethink it and you have to reschedule it. That's the problem. Securing the stakeholders, then you need to know who's involved in this. Users, citizens, and technologies, private sector, government, agencies, departments, different departments, regulatory bodies. All of these bodies are stakeholders. So you will come up with a room full of stakeholders, hundreds of them. Everybody has their own interest in this system. Therefore, you have to listen to every single one of these people because they have a point of view and they have a point to achieve. Therefore, stakeholders are very important. And how you manage this stakeholder, this large army of stakeholders, in fact. It's an administration nightmare, basically. So you need to be very much prepared to take on tasks like this. Then you're looking at the implementation strategies. Okay, now we know everything we do. Now we have everybody's attention. Now we have finance. Now we have leadership. Now we have all of these. How we implement that? There we have to have a strategy in the phase-based strategy. Okay, again, I say it doesn't happen in a big bang, and you cannot do it, and it's a big mistake to do that. So you must have phases in order to achieve it, milestones, and also you check every time. You have to have a control body, a body that controls everything, make sure oversees every output in every milestone. Then you're looking at the evaluation of results. Here we have very important point. This whole government or e-government story is about 3 different engineering disciplines. We need a social engineering, organizational engineering, and systems engineering. And starts with the organizational engineering. So the government has to re-engineer themselves organizational-wise. Therefore, the government organization has to re-engineer themselves and reinvent themselves and get themselves prepared for the future. Secondly is the social engineering. You have to get the people prepared. I published a couple of papers just about the digital society. So you need to have a digital literacy in your society. You need to have clients. So e-government is a business, right? You opening your business, there is no customer. What's the point of that? There is no point. You need to have customers. Who's your customer? Is your citizen. So you need to prepare your citizen. You need to lift the digital literacy of your citizen in order to make sure your business have a client. People come and use it, right? So that's social engineering. And finally, at the end, you have systems engineering. Then you have technology people who knows how these things work, and then put in place all the computers, networks, devices, everything that you need to be in place in order to achieve all these things together. Therefore, and then when we talk about three different engineering, social, organizational, and technology, when we use the word engineering, we also definitely mean something that is measurable. When you engineer, you have to measure. Okay? So when you're making a table, then you have to, after you finish, you have to measure it to see if it's actually fitting the requirements that you had in your plan, in your little sketch, right? So how we measure things? We need to have to put in place all the measurements, all the parameters, all the categories that we need to measure. And then at the end of every milestone, we have to look at those things. All right, we've been doing all of these for, like, say, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. All right, what is the outcome of this? Whether it fits into our plan? Should we go back and revise our plan? So at the end of the day, everything is a living project. Nothing is written in stone. Everything has to be updatable, has to be live. Therefore, you have to measure infrastructure to improve, looking at the improvement and connectivity and data processing capability or capacity. Then in terms of governance, you have to look at e-government management frameworks in place. We talked about all these. So these are the things you have to measure. You have to measure institutional capacity. Do you have a population, digital literacy in your population that, prepare your customers? Do you have a geographical reach of government? Does government reach only in Suleimania people? Or does it reach in Kalar? Or in, the Jalola, just a few days ago, was liberated. Can you reach there? Can you reach to the smallest villages everywhere? So to do that, you need two things. First of all, government has to reach there. Secondly, has to educate the people in terms of digital literacy, in order to make customers for themselves, right? Or secure customers, basically. Then you have to train your resources. You need to have people who know how to do all of these things, and that's a massive task itself. And also, business processes re-engineering. What does that mean? That means government is doing everything in their own way right now, currently, right? But we are sure at least 70 or 80% of whatever we're doing right now is not really compatible with advanced digital e-government processes and things like that. Therefore, when you are replacing a manual process with a digital process, definitely you need a process re-engineering. You have to look at, go back and look at every single process that you're doing in your government and see how does that affect the knowledge of your people, the way they do stuff, when the digitalization come about. And you get yourself prepared for that. You can't just bring about a bunch of computers and softwares and applications and put them in place and people sit around, don't know how to use them. Okay, so now, there's a lot to say about these things, but, I think I've mentioned a few things about governance. Now, I will look at things such as implementation of these systems. Now, we imagine all of these happen. Okay, we have research, we have planning, then we have all the organizational and institutional re-engineering and training in place. Now, we want to know how we actually implementing e-government. There are three main obstacles that it's out of research and also implementation. It's been mentioned, I worked 12 years in electronic government, large-scale applications for federal government in Australia. Main issues that these are the things actually in my literature, in my publications, you can find those things that have all been published. is talking about choosing technology framework. We are talking about service delivery. What is government about? That's it. Only service delivery. Government does nothing but delivering service to people. And themselves, of course. Or interagency as well. So you need to have a framework in order to make it work. The other thing which is a lot more important, is the unfamiliar semantics. That means different agencies in the same government use different terms for the same thing. And vice versa. One single thing have different names in different places. For example, zip code, postcode, and area code are all the same thing, are all pointing to the same thing. Now, if you develop 3 different applications in 3 different government agencies mentioning these 3 things, you come up with a problem with your digital applications. Why? Because applications are not smart enough to do that. So we have to find a way in order to make sure that we have a semantic compatibility or semantic interoperability between agencies throughout the government, so they understand each other. Because we're not talking about people talking to each other. We're talking about systems talking to each other. So systems has to be semantically intelligent. If you don't have semantic intelligence in the systems that you're developing, these different agencies do not understand each other. Therefore, you have a chaos going on and a duplication of a whole lot of work that has to be done. And finally is the complexity of interagency regulation and rule. So there are many cases in any government that when you want to do something as a citizen, you're not dealing with one agency all the time. You're usually dealing with multiple agencies. There are many examples of that in publications and in real life as well. For example, if you want to get a building permit, right? I don't know how it works here. For example, in Australia, you deal with at least 3 agencies. Environmental agencies, council, and then, I don't know, a few other agencies, right? So these agencies have their own regulations. Now we have to look at them. Are these regulations compatible? Do you have conflict between them? How you resolve these conflicts? Okay? Now we look at a little bit of an evolutionary trend of electronic government in one example, which is Australian government evolution, which started with presence in the web, long time ago, 1995, 6, something like that. So the first step was to actually bring their own websites. Every agency opened their websites and presented themselves that we exist, right? That's around 25 years ago. And then the second step they actually included some transactions in there. So the transaction means that the citizen could go into the website and fill up some form and apply for something, right? And that form will go to the government and they will consider it and they come back to the citizen with an email or something, following up on their request. Could you please let me know if I'm going over time? I am certainly. Okay, I tried to run through very quickly, but that's actually an important part. And then stages happens, and the final stage that we're looking at the moment is the composition of electronic services. Now Australian government is looking at, we have a whole lot of services available online, but how we can actually intelligently compose these services and provide complex services online for the citizens. How citizens can do that, and how can we intelligently achieve that composition without the human intervention. So that's actually one of the areas that I worked on. I looked at intelligent algorithms in order to, without human intervention, compose web services online and provide something that we talk about it, is called live event. Okay, so in order to achieve that integration, we need to integrate 2 parts of the government. One is the back end, the other one is the front end. So for every one of these areas, we have different technologies that they actually being used and recommended and more popular because they work better. So in backend you have ERPs, which is enterprise resource planning systems, or EAI, enterprise integration, business intelligence. We're looking at cloud computing. At this point, 35% of electronic government in Australia is actually in cloud. Now, the cloud is the latest step of electronic government in Australia. In front end, we're looking at integrating services, front-end services for the government. Now, in Australia, we have one website for the whole of government in all three levels. We have federal, state, and local. They're all is one website. You go there and you type in there what you want to do. And then you're not aware who does it. And that's the purpose. The citizen should not or doesn't need to know which agency in the government or how many agencies are involved to give me service. I just go there and I tell them I want to move my house, or I want a motorbike license. I don't care how many agencies are going to do it. All I know is the government, and that's the only one website, and it has an connectivity between all the agencies involved in providing that service. For those, we use technologies and frameworks such as service-oriented architecture, which is the basis of most of the technologies that we use. Is the most popular and most used framework. We also use web services as a basis for the service-oriented architecture. In terms of intelligence, semantic intelligence, we use something called OWLS, which is an ontology web language. Which is an algorithm, which is a ontology-based knowledge base. It's not a database; it's a knowledge base. We're looking at knowledge bases such as life event ontology, and that's our invention. So we invented this term, life event. I will talk about this life event at the end. So what we wanted to, how we achieved the whole of government body is by assigning, because we're looking at citizen-centric service providing, we're looking at the government services from citizen point of view. Okay? What does a citizen have? Life event. Life event means something that happens in a citizen's life, right? So, for example, I get married. I already did. Not again. So, I get married. What do I want to do? I go to several agencies, I register myself, I apply for something, apply for this, apply for that, apply for that. That is a life event as a citizen, right? So if we can standardize a unit for government services, life event is the best unit of work for a citizen. So a citizen doesn't know anything but a life event. Every request of a citizen to a government is one type of life event. So we come up with this term of life event, and we try to package all those services that could provide a citizen with all the services to perform a life event. Is the basic unit of the whole e-government. So if that pyramid on the left, your left or my right, so you can see it's how the e-government is comprised of small little life events that every citizen can invoke. For example, moving house, right? If I want to move house, I invoke that life event. And this whole life event has a whole lot of technology, implementation, processes, and data involved in order to implement it or perform it. But citizens do not see those complexity. Citizens only see a government with a lot of life events to provide. Okay, so I'm at the end of my speech, so I just show you a few publications that I have done and with my colleagues. If you're interested, you could probably have a look at those things. It'll give you a little more insight on in the implementation, especially some of those. I have couple of publications specifically about Kurdistan literacy, digital literacy in Kurdistan, and also a couple of chapter that the book is coming out in 6-7 months, hopefully. But the other things, publications are mostly about the implementation of these strategies for government. All right, and thank you very much for attention.